Thanks very much for joining us. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Peter Llewellyn. I run the services at MedComsNetworking.com, and the associated websites. So services for people who work in and around Medcoms, the global Medcoms community, medical communications, medical education, medical publishing. Lots of activities, lots of services, lots of information, and so on. But one of the things I've done for the last few years is send out, is do quite a lot of work for people, supporting people who want to come into Medcoms and learn about medical writing and associated type businesses. You'll find loads of information at FirstMedCommsJob.com. So with these webinars, which are great because we can involve all sorts of people from all over the place, today we're going to have a discussion with the guys from Bioscript. So thank you very much for joining us. We're going to talk specifically about regulatory writing. So a little bit different to what I mostly focus on as Medcoms, and we'll try and draw some distinction and compare and contrast between Medcoms and regulatory writing. But I think if you're looking at medical writing, it's important to understand those differences, and regulatory writing is a big area, and Bioscript actually cover medical communications and regulatory and so on. So you're in a good position to focus on regulatory, but also draw a little bit of comparison, contrast with the Medcoms side. So thank you very much. I'm going to hand over to you guys. I think Vicky's going to lead the way. So presentation and then a Q&A session. And members of the audience, please, you've got a chat box and a Q&A box. Send in your questions, observations and comments as usual. We'll build that into the conversation. So Vicky, over to you.
Okay, hi everyone. There are 4 of us from Bioscript joining in this webinar, and we're just going to start with a brief introduction about each of us. So I'm Vicky. I'm a regulatory writing specialist, which means I'm involved in both writing and training at Bioscript. My original background was in biochemistry, but since then I've had 22 years of being a regulatory writer, which I started in a pharmaceutical company, and I've been at Bioscript for about 5.5 years. There's 2 main things that I really enjoy and I'm most motivated about being a regulatory writer. So I like the fact that we can make a contribution towards the development and approval of medicines, particularly for life-threatening conditions. I find that very motivating. And I'm also really interested in the way clinical studies are designed and the interpretation of data. So I'm happy to answer any questions at the end, but we'll move on to Claire.
Me. Hi, my name's Claire. I'm a principal regulatory writer here at Bioscript for just over a year. And I've been a medical writer for around 15 years, and I work home-based in Belfast. So how did I get into regulatory writing? Well, I graduated university with a medical degree and actually worked as a doctor for a couple of years, but decided the hospital life wasn't for me. I didn't really have a backup plan at that time, so I decided to move abroad to teach English. And it was in Berlin that I discovered medical writing and got my first medical writing job. And my first job involved writing independent imaging charters, a bit off the beaten track, for submission to regulatory authorities. That's like a protocol for how radiologists measure the disease on CT scans, and isn't a typical first medical writing job. But after that, I moved to early phase and then late phase departments and gained experience writing clinical study reports, protocols, and informed consent. For the last 7 years, I've really focused on oncology submissions, so that's my main forte. And what I really enjoy is being part of the submissions to regulatory authorities and contributing to all the strategic discussions that go on around that. There's a great satisfaction getting to the bottom of data and completing a well-written document, regardless of whether a license is granted or not. But when a submission is successful, particularly in cancer, it is really satisfying to know that you've helped to make a new anti-cancer treatment available, because a new drug may only add a few months to a patient's life, but that can mean the world to a cancer patient and their family.
Hi everyone, my name is Martin. I'm a senior regulatory writer here at Bioscript. My background is in pharmacology, and overall I have about 13 years industry experience, of which I spent the last 8.5 being a regulatory writer, and I joined Bioscript in May of last year. One of the things that I enjoy most about being a medical writer is that we have involvement at various stages through clinical development. So whether that is writing clinical study protocols and their amendments through sort of interim or final clinical study reports, or the kind of periodic reporting in between, that summation and distilling of study data and clinical interpretations in the real world situations that Claire spoke to there is an important and exciting part of the work that we do.
Hi everyone, I'm Cameron and I've been an associate regulatory writer with Bioscript for 6 months now. And I'm based in London, working from home. So I studied medicine at university and then I worked for a medical device company for a year before starting at Bioscript. And my favorite aspect of the job is just being able to see like all the different stages of drug development and the clinical trials. And I also just really enjoy the balance I get of sort of working my own when I'm, say, diving like deep into the project I'm working on, then balance with getting to work with various teams as well and gaining project management experience.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Got you.
I think I got accidentally muted there. So we're going to talk a little bit about what regulatory writing is and the process of how we write our documents. So during the non-clinical part of a drug's life cycle, when it passes through the laboratory and animal testing stage, a dose will be determined that's considered safe to start in humans, and the drug will then enter clinical development. And this is where regulatory writers fit in. So we produce all the documents needed to support the clinical development of a drug. And you can think of clinical development as an ongoing cycle split into 3 main areas. So if we start with the top left, this is the pre-marketing clinical development stage. This means the drug hasn't got a license yet, and it has to run through phase 1 to phase 3 clinical trials in order to accumulate enough data to be ready to submit for a license request. So we write the protocols and the other documents that make up the clinical trial application or the investigational new drug application for the US. And that's asking the regulators, can we start the trial? And then we write any amendments to those protocols when the design changes. So phase 1 is where the drug may be given to small numbers of healthy volunteers, and safety is the initial focus. And then at the other end of the scale, when it gets to phase 3, the drug is given to large numbers of patients who actually have the disease and where efficacy is also of prime importance. So if those phase 3 results show the drug has an acceptable safety profile and is better than the standard of care or the best treatment currently available on the market, then the company may decide to submit a marketing license application. That's known as an MAA in the EU and an NDA in the US. So a large amount of data, including the results from the pivotal clinical study reports, which are the key studies in the submission, they're written up by regulatory writers, and then our regulatory affairs colleagues send this information to the global regulatory authorities to request that the drug be put on the market so that doctors can then prescribe that to their patients. And if the drug is granted a marketing license, it doesn't mean that work stops there. There may be post-marketing phase 4 studies performed, for example, observational studies in very large amounts of patients who are outside of the clinical trials, but who are prescribed the drug by their doctor in the real world. And because a much larger number of patients are taking the drug compared to those in the clinical trial and for a longer period of time, this provides a lot of information on the long-term safety and efficacy of a drug. In addition, when a license is given for a drug, it's usually restricted to a very specific disease type. So for example, an anti-cancer drug may be licensed only for use in melanoma. However, the company may want to put that drug back into pre-marketing clinical development and develop that for additional uses, such as in lung cancer patients. So drug development is very much an ongoing cyclical process, and the work for regulatory writers is never done. And I've listed the typical documents that we write during these 3 stages in the corners of the slides. But the types of documents written are very similar at each stage. But I would say that during a marketing license application, there will be a lot more data submitted in addition to pivotal CSRs, including high-level clinical overviews and summary documents that regulatory writers will also be tasked with writing. Okay, so what do we write about in clinical documents? So we usually start by describing the study design, explaining how the study was carried out, which is based on the protocol. The design is important as we are trying to show that the trial excluded bias as far as possible and that the test drug was compared to the best alternative treatment currently on the market, if there is one, and that the endpoints and the statistical methods chosen were appropriate for analysing the results and excluding any effects due to chance as far as possible. So following the study design, we would write about the results of the study, and we can split this into safety, efficacy, and pharmacology typically. So for our safety analysis, we look at what types of side effects patients had during the study, how serious were they manageable, were patients able to tolerate them, or did they cause the patient to stop taking the drug or to drop out of the study? After all, a side effect might not be considered serious, but if it was so unpleasant that the majority of patients stopped taking the drug, well, that obviously impacts efficacy. I mean, you have to be taking a drug in order for it to work, right? So the efficacy analysis tries to answer the question of, was the drug effective? Did it work in the patients with that disease? Was there a difference observed when compared with the standard of care? Was the difference between the drug and the comparator statistically significant, or could it have been due to chance? And can you show that this difference was something that was clinically meaningful and of real benefit to the patient? And then we have the pharmacology section, which looks essentially at pharmacokinetics, and that's how the body affects the drug in terms of absorption, excretion, and metabolism, etc., and pharmacodynamics, which is how the drug affects the body. So what effect does it have on the heart or the liver enzymes, for example? So we're regulatory writers, and what kind of regulatory guidance do we follow? We need to be aware of the regulatory guidance published for the documents that we write. The International Council for Harmonisation, ICH, was born in 1990, and it was formed in order to standardise the data required for global submissions, improve global communication and patient safety, and reduce redundancy in regional testing. So representatives of the regulatory agencies and industry from Europe, Japan, and the US, they met and began to agree on a set of common guidelines that everyone could follow. So typically on a particular topic, you can find ICH guidelines, which are the international ones applied across the regions. And then you'll find guidelines from the separate key markets of the EU, United States, and Japan. Now, the regional guidelines are really very closely based on the ICH guidelines, so you won't see much difference between them, but there will be nuances adjusted in order to make the data more suitable for those particular regions. So the document you write for submission to the EMA in Europe or the FDA in the States, they will be very similar, but you may make changes to the document and include additional data that's needed for that particular market. And I included 2 examples of guidance that regulatory writers use. So you might want to mention these 2 guidances if you are going for your first job interview. And the first one is the Guideline for Good Clinical Practice, the E6R2. So that covers documents such as the protocol, the IB, and the informed consent that we write used to run a clinical trial. And then there's the E3 Structure and Content of Clinical Study Report Guidance, which basically describes what it says on the tin. It's the basis for the content and the layout of clinical study reports that we write describing the results of the study. So document templates are built in the back of these guidances. And so we need to be aware of them and adhere to them as much as possible, because standardization is very important for good clinical practice. But I will just add that the regulatory authorities have also made it clear that these are guidances which aim to assist standardization. They're not regulations, they're not directives which have legal implications. So if there is something in the guidance that does not apply to your study, or perhaps it's just presented better in a different way, it is okay to deviate from the guidance as long as you can justify that. So many people are confused about the difference between what a regulatory writer does and what a medical communications writer does. And they're both types of medical writing, of course, and Bioscript offers both roles. And it mainly comes down to the audience that you're writing for and the types of documents that you're writing. So as regulatory writers, it's no surprise that our target audience is the regulatory authorities. And we're aiming to show them why they should give permission for a trial to go ahead, or why they should consider putting a new drug on the market, or add a new disease area for that drug. There are, of course, other people that use the documents that we write, such as the investigators who carry out the clinical trial, the ethics committees who must also give the green light for a trial to go ahead, and the patients taking part in the clinical trial who need to sign informed consent. But our key audience is really the regulators. And then on the Medcoms side, they're really communicating the results of the drug to the wider scientific community at large and the public, such as doctors, researchers, advisory boards, attendees at medical conferences, which they might have to attend, and patients. So the documents we write are very much oriented to the audience we're trying to reach. And you can see here a list of the typical documents that regulatory writers might write versus medical communication writers. If you take the clinical study report, for example, regulatory writers are the first person to see the results of the trial, and we're the ones closest to that data. So we receive a massive amount of data from the statisticians on safety, efficacy, pharmacology, and we need to summarize that in the form of narrative text accompanied by many tables and figures, so that we can draw conclusions from that and discuss the implications. And don't be fooled by the word summarize, because some clinical study reports, particularly in oncology, can be 300 to 400 plus pages long. So regulatory writers really do take a very deep dive into the data, and it may take quite a few months to write a clinical study report. There could be very tight regulatory timelines to meet. All of the other documents within the submission need to be aligned with each other. So we need really effective communication with other writers. Every sentence is scrutinized and revised again and again if needed. And we need to be extremely precise with the wording we use, be very science-based and factual, and avoid any terminology that could be perceived to be promotional in any way. So the medical communications writer might then take that clinical study report and maybe others and use what we've written along with other source data to write up a journal manuscript or to prepare a slide presentation to broadcast those results and information to the wider community. And since Medcoms writers have a wider range of audiences, they may use various formats. So Word, PowerPoint, posters, online digital content, whereas regulatory writers, we always write our documents in Microsoft Word. And to achieve global standardization, we use templates and we use the regulatory guidelines. And we tend to lay out our documents in a very similar way. So Medcoms writers may have more scope to vary their documents from one to the next. But saying that, there's really nothing formulaic about regulatory writing, because every study is different. Even after many years of regulatory writing, you'll always come up against something new, an endpoint you've never seen before, a new statistical analysis, a new study design, since clinical study design is changing a lot as time goes on. And every team you work with has a different approach to their data. So in that way, every day is different. So with that, I'll pass over to Martin, who will talk a little bit about the process used to create regulatory documents.
Okay. Sorry, bear with me, my screen has frozen here.
Computer says no.
We're hearing you fine.
Okay. So yeah, a quick kind of whistle-stop tour of the documents that we will work on. So as a regulatory writer, as Claire's spoken to, we will have to engage with various groups within the client teams. So whether that's clinical, working with the medics, safety, if we're looking at pharmacovigilance, biostatistics for the data and the statistical analysis applied to those data, through regulatory affairs, clinical operations and clinical pharmacology. It's all a case of communicating with these different teams and working together to really pull everything together as one. Next slide, please, Cameron. So what could a typical document timeline look like? Here we have an example timeline for a document. Almost always we'll have a kickoff meeting. That's abbreviated to KOM, it's at the top row, at the start of the process, where we will meet with the client functional groups. And by functional groups, we mean the different departments within that client team, such as clinical, biostatistics, data management, the groups that we saw on the previous slide. And in that meeting, we will discuss and identify the scope and the needs of the document and agree upon team lists, including who should be involved in reviews and who from the team will eventually sign off and approve the document. And also at that meeting, we will confirm overall timelines and expectations. We would then have a period of writing draft 1 of the document, followed by a period of time for the team to review this first draft. That's usually done in a shared environment where multiple reviewers can comment and edit in real time within the same document. So as medical writers, we would then collate and triage the team comments ahead of the comment resolution meeting, which is abbreviated to CRM. This meeting is an opportunity for the wider team to discuss comments or edits that need cross-functional input or expertise to resolve any pending items that have followed on from the review. So these types of meetings will always include direct contact with the client teams. After this, we would update the document accordingly and put it out for another round of review, after which again, the collation and triage of comments, the meeting for the comment resolution, and the updates will follow as they did for draft 1. So after the agreed review rounds and updates have all been completed, we move to finalisation, where the document undergoes quality control, abbreviated to QC, and that is usually a check of the document for accuracy. So that includes source data verification, and as Claire had said in the previous slide about the length of some of the CSRs, you can imagine that is a very specific task that is a straight check against the source data. And during QC, we'll also follow compliance with style preferences that the client has by way of their style guide, as well as readability, consistency, and sense within the document. And here at Bioscript, we have our own QC team who work with our regulatory writers to help ensure that the documents that we are working on are accurate and of high quality. So the tail end of this for the medical writers is that we then update the document with any of those final QC findings before providing that final version to the client for sign-off and publishing activities. And as the title on the slide alludes to, project times aren't always set in stone and are definitely something that are subject to change, sometimes at short notice. And they can also be kind of further complicated by working in teams that have different time zones or any delays or modifications to other documents in a pipeline that feed into the document you're working on. So the example that Claire gave about some of the submission work where there's multiple documents being written in parallel, some feed into others, there's implications for timelines there. So what are some of the traits of a successful medical writer? Well, here we've split this into two main categories with kind of key attributes for each. On the left-hand side for skills, I'm going to start with communication because communication really is key. definition of communication is the imparting or exchanging of information by speaking, writing, or using some other medium. So when we refer to communication, we don't just mean our interaction with others. That's important, but it goes beyond this. As regulatory writers, a key role and an essential purpose of ours is to be able to communicate scientific messaging in the documents that we produce. And for that, we need to be able to convey clear, succinct, grammatically correct messaging in our documents that's fit for the intended audience, which are the regulatory bodies for the most part. So as with any job that involves working globally and cross-culturally, we also need to have clear and effective written and verbal communication. Other key attributes include technical skills for formatting documents. So for example, a good use of Microsoft Word, research skills and a drive to proactively seek solutions and problem solve any obstacles that might pop up. That also ties in with our leadership qualities. And we should also have an eye for detail to ensure quality and consistency in everything we produce. As I said in the timeline slide, we need to be able to adapt, often at short notice, and that includes to changing scopes of work, timelines, client requests, and we also need to bear in mind that we need to be professional in our interaction with clients and in giving and receiving constructive feedback. In terms of knowledge, on the right-hand side of this slide, we should have a good understanding of clinical development processes and regulatory guidance and key purpose of the documents that we're writing, and bearing in mind the audience for those documents at all times, and a general understanding of statistical interpretation. Knowledge of disease areas is helpful, but oftentimes better understanding of therapeutic areas comes with the opportunities to work with certain disease types. So what would a typical career path for a regulatory medical writer look like? Well, at Bioscript, career progression is similar to that of the overall medical writing career path for regulatory writers, whereby the entry level to regulatory writing would be as an associate writer, then to a regulatory writer, followed by senior and principal posts, before a kind of split to either writing specialist or director level. And as would be expected, there is increased responsibility and the expectation is to work under minimal supervision as you kind of progress through these regulatory writing grades. So, if you're interested in a career as a regulatory medical writer, this slide just covers, what does Bioscript have to offer? Well, we're continuing to grow as a company, and we've got around 25 regulatory writers currently, with another 10 members of our kind of wider team who make up project management and our quality control groups. Our head office is in Macclesfield in England. However, we have home-based writers in England, Scotland, Ireland, Germany, and in the US currently. Associate writers joining our group are given on-the-job training and are supported and mentored throughout their development, which is very much assisted by the very friendly, approachable, and welcoming group that we have that help to achieve this. We also have, as Claire's mentioned, a wide range of regulatory documents that we work on, which makes the job exciting and opens doors to different opportunities. Bioscript as a company also values a work-life balance, which is supported by a number of wellness and well-being programs. And as a company, they're very supportive of home working. In fact, 3 out of the 4 of us presenting today are home-based, myself, Claire, and Cameron. And although Vicky is working from home now more given the situation with the pandemic, office visits are encouraged when safe and possible to do so. So for more information, I guess, and details on openings for regulatory writing positions at Bioscript, feel free to visit our company website or visit our LinkedIn profile. Thank you. And back to Peter for the Q&A.
Excellent, thanks guys. Lose the slides. That's fantastic. Thank you very much. Okay, so we've got time for some questions and a bit of a discussion. Those of you who are watching us today, please do use the text boxes at the bottom of your window. You'll find a Q&A button and a chat button. They'll call up different text boxes. Use either text box. We'll see all the questions coming in, and we'll weave your comments and questions into the conversation. Okay. So let's just kick off with an obvious one, and but which sort of gets to the heart of what I'm about, as it were. I think I'm right in saying, but correct me if I'm wrong, none of you have worked in medical communications as such, have you? You are all regulatory writers. Just give me a quick nod. I'm not getting that wrong. That's right. Okay. So, I mean, it was very interesting. I mean, what you did was very nicely, just trying to draw the distinction between the sorts of documents and so on you work on, which said a lot. But what I always just try and think about, you know, what is the difference between a regulatory writer and a MedComms writer? And accepting the fact you haven't done MedComms, you're regulatory. So the question, I guess, is why did you guys go regulatory? Did you think about other sorts of medical writing? MedComms, but other sorts, or did you not? Did you just go down the regulatory writing route? I mean, each of you, can you just talk a little bit more about what that process was? And as I say, it might just be you never knew there was any other sort of medical writing. But if somebody says to me, I want to be a medical writer, I go, what sort of medical writer do you want to be? And then you get into quite a complicated conversation. But what was your thinking? I'm going to start with Cameron if I can, because I think, you know, you said you've been in a few months, so you're the sort of the freshest, as it were. What was your thinking when you were coming in?
So I was actually fairly interested in both types of medical writing, but I think regulatory finally won. I think really like the kind of depth you get to go into the clinical trials just makes it more interesting for me. You get like such big data sets. There's a lot of interpretation to be done. Although I was saying that I don't know if there's probably that to do in MedComms as well, but for me it's just getting to dive deep into a clinical trial and learn all the ins and outs of it was what appealed to me.
Okay, as I said, it can be difficult. You haven't done the two, so you can't compare and contrast. I just try and get a sense of what took you down the route. So it was about getting to grips with data in real depth, yeah, and you saw that as something you were attracted to. So who else can put something in? Martin, what was your sort of thinking?
So for me, when I started out, I was part of a pharmacovigilance department with a large CRO. And as part of that, I was having to have input into certain safety reports that were getting written. And I first became aware of medical writing, so regulatory writing. Through that, I had medical writing colleagues at that CRO who I worked with. And that kind of got me asking questions about what's regulatory writing. And when I found out more about it, it was something I was very much interested in. That was my inroad. So I kind of moved from one department to the other, but it was based on my experience of the document types I was working with at that time.
Okay. It's quite interesting because I think I'm right in saying all of you have got some sort of industry experience before you. You haven't come straight in from a sort of academic PhD type of environment, and maybe we'll come back to that. But Claire, you come in from albeit from that sort of background, but before that it was medical background, and we had a question come in very early on about medics coming into regulatory writing. So again, just give us a little bit more of a sense of your sort of journey in and your thinking, and whether you considered other sorts of medical writing.
Yeah, I haven't met anybody else with a medical background. I've met some people with nursing backgrounds. Sorry, how did I get into regulatory writing?
Yeah, and why did you choose regulatory writing? Did you think about other sorts of medical writing, or did you not?
Yeah, I didn't know the difference between them, but okay. I thought all medical writing was regulatory writing. And I actually went to a job interview in London because I wasn't finding anything in Berlin. So I flew to London for a job interview, and they actually asked me, I thought it was I talked all about regulatory writing, and they said to me, so are you more their question to me was, are you more interested in getting into the science, or are you more interested in sort of more creative aspects as well? And I said, oh, I want the science, the hard science, because that's my background. Surprise, I didn't get the job and didn't realize until years later, oh, that's why, it was actually MedComms.
Okay. But this is the sort of thing that I find interesting. And obviously one of the things I'm trying to do is help people understand those differences by listening to you talking and publishing the guides and so on. So it's interesting just to get a flavour of your thinking. Vicky, same question to you. Just give us a little bit of flavour from your point of view. Did you think about the options?
So I spent a few years as a bench scientist in academia, and I decided I quite like the sound of medical writing. I started looking around at what types of jobs medical writers did to try and understand it. I noticed that at the time, bearing in mind this is, you know, a while ago, that it was difficult to get into MedComms writing without experience. There weren't that many openings for people who were just like a bench scientist in research and not having had any experience other than writing a PhD thesis and a couple of publications, but that wasn't enough to have you know, jump into MedComms roles at the time. And so I contacted the head of the regulatory writing group at a pharmaceutical company and went in to have a chat, and they gave me a 3-month probationary period to see if the role fitted me and they liked me. And yep, so 22 years later, I'm still in regulatory writing. I never actually experienced any MedComms writing. I don't know if that helps.
Okay. No, I think it just helps that just hearing you talking. I mean, it's different routes for everybody, and for instance, just to pick up on that point, and I guess Bioscript would want to make that point at the moment, that you know that you do accept entry level writers into MedComms without that experience, and there's a lot of opportunity within MedComms now. But so it's very individual, and it depends a little bit on who you talk to and when you talk to them and so on. Which is interesting to hear some of the background. There's a number of questions. We've got quite a few questions coming in. I'm just trying to sort of group them in my head a little bit. Number of questions coming in about what sort of skills do you need in stats, bioinformatics, programming, data analysis, and things like that. Who wants to just sort of clarify a little bit or talk a little bit on that? Claire, you're nodding your head, so go on. I'm going to go with you on that one. Just talk a little bit about how much do they actually need to know about stats, etc., before they come in.
Yeah, you definitely don't need any programming skills, and because the statistical programmers do the programming, and the statisticians do the analysis. So then we get the data after that. I mean, obviously, I had statistics as an undergraduate medical course, but I mean, I wouldn't say I remembered. It was great grounding, I have to say. I think if you're brand new to statistics, it might be tough. But usually, some people have some level, and I would say just a basic level of, you know, what does statistically significant mean? What is a p-value? What are a confidence intervals? And that's, you know, you learn the rest on the job, is what I would say. So it's not something you have to, and other people are asking how much you need to know about clinical study design. And the same thing, you don't have to know about clinical study design. You just need some basic knowledge of, you know, clinical trials, maybe run through phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 before pre-market, and then phase 4 post-market. And, you know, those guidances that I mentioned, you can get those online. They're freely available. Just Google them, download them, and have a look at those. And I think if you can mention those guidances and be aware of them for your interview, that's all you need, because everything else you will learn on the job.
Yeah, could I just add as well that at Bioscript, we specifically provide training in the basics of statistics for clinical trials and study design and clinical drug development and that kind of thing. So that's specifically part of our training at Bioscript.
Yeah.
And Vicky, sorry, I was going to bring you in because I'm right, aren't I? You basically do oversee the training aspect of the writers. That's part of your role, isn't it? So, you know, how much of it is on the job training, and how much of it is, you know, formalized teaching, and how much of it is external as opposed to internal type training exercises?
So I think that you can't. There's nothing better than learning on the job. So our associates pretty much start on writing documents right from their first week. We obviously an associate writer would have a mentor and somebody to peer review their documents. They'd be able to shadow people, you know, attend a few meetings with more experienced writers to get an understanding and a feeling of how we do these things. And then alongside starting to pick up the simpler, more straightforward documents, we provide sort of more formal training sessions. For most of it's provided internally, but we do get like a professional statistician, for example, in to do training on statistics. Anything that not really an expert in, we would get somebody in. But we've had people with backgrounds in clinical pharmacology and in label development and that kind of thing who've been or are part of the Bioscript regulatory writing team. So we try to take advantage of people's previous experience to support the training. So I don't do all the training myself.
So it's very tailored around the individual. So and depending on their pace and so on, you can adapt your training. Is there? I mean, there's been I think it's come in a couple of times actually. A question: Is there a simple answer to this question? Is there a course that I can take if I want to be a regulatory writer that would appear, that you would look at and go, great, he's got that course?
Not that I know of, but there is training available on the ICH Good Clinical Practice. There are training courses available online, and at a minimum, it would be it's not the most exciting thing to sit and read. It's quite a lengthy document, but that is, it's pretty essential background knowledge. Again, we would help people with understanding and training in that, but if they already had some training in that ahead of applying for a job, then that would be great. Other than that, really, it's just having enthusiasm for the science and learning new things.
Okay. I do think it's something
there's
that's
also
worth. Sorry, go on.
There's also the European Medical Writers Association. I was just thinking of, they might do some courses in, what medical writing is, what regulatory writing is.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, thanks, Claire. I'd forgotten about EMWA, and similarly AMWA as well.
So EMWA, the European Medical Writers Association, AMWA, either the American or the Australasian, depending on which way of the part of the world you're in, medical writing associations, they will produce resources and information. I think that my comment to people generally about all of this is you can do a lot of research nowadays, guys, so at least have an understanding of what they're talking about. But you are not, if you're being taken on as an entry-level writer, you're not expected to be a medical writer. You're going to get trained, but don't walk in not knowing nothing, because actually you can find out a lot online now from the various activities that are going on. There were, picking up on an earlier point, but Claire, I think it was, how common is it to go into medical writing directly from a PhD? So, I mean, that's as it happens, I think we said, you've all got some industry experience and so on, but coming in from PhD, from postdoc land or whatever, is not uncommon, is it?
Oh no, there's plenty of people that have PhDs, yeah.
And what about somebody was asking about a portfolio. What sort of portfolio do you need? And that leads into the whole sort of, when you're bringing people, when you're looking at people, are you looking at things like, have they got a portfolio, and what does that mean? What about things like writing tests? Presumably you would be subjecting any applicants to a writing test. So again, just briefly, and maybe Vicky, maybe you could just say a few words on that front. What are you looking for, and what can people come along with that's appealing?
Yeah, so we do administer writing tests as part of the recruitment process. For associates, there's a couple of tasks which they're largely around being given a small amount of data and being able to interpret it. Nothing that you would really need previous experience for, but just looking at the data, can you logically interpret and write a short paragraph to summarize that table of data? And then another test that we run is it's more of an attention to detail and grammatical standards. So you're given a piece of writing with deliberate errors. There may be typos, grammatical errors, inconsistencies within that piece of writing. So we ask the writer to spot the deliberate errors. And then for more senior recruitment, in case there are people who are already regulatory writers in the audience, we also have a test where you're given more like a complex task, where you are given the basics of a study design and some key data, and you're asked to write a larger summary of why is the study being done, what were the key methods, what are the key results. So that's pretty much our tests.
And that attention to detail point is something we're just banging on about all the time in all these sorts of conversations. It's you know, we can't overemphasize how important that is, which is, you know, and it starts with somebody sending you an email or you know, for goodness sake, if they're writing to you, think about that right from the word go. You know, spell your name correctly, you know, put a sentence together properly, because you're going to be judging all of that all the way down the line. Yeah. What
Yes.
the sorry, we are running out of time, really. But so can you answer this question, which has come in a couple of times as well? So there's obviously a couple of people in the audience who are sort of MedComsy, but let's, you know, whether it's MedComs specifically or you know, experienced in medical writing, wanting to move into regulatory writing, just can you sort of give an indication of, would they be coming across as some sort of principal or senior medical writer because they've got the writing experience, or would they start as an associate medical writer because they haven't got the regulatory experience? Do you see what I'm saying?
Yes, so we've had a few people join Bioscript regulatory from MedComms roles, and given that they've already got some writing experience and some background knowledge that's relevant, then we wouldn't generally bring them in as an associate. We would bring them at a higher level, depending on the level of experience, but definitely not at the associate. We'll be able to bring them in at least as a regulatory writer, if not higher, depending on the number of years of experience and some of the specifics. But yeah, there will be a slightly, you know, you would be able to leapfrog a bit if you were coming in. Yeah,
that makes sense. So again, it's very tailored around the individuals. It's which is just an important point to put out there. And you know, so you know, you'd be encouraging people with that sort of different sorts of writing experience to come in, yeah?
Oh yes, absolutely.
Okay, cool. And we are slightly over time, so maybe we should stop on that positive note and just say a huge thank you to all of you. It's just, I always find these things just interesting, just listening to you talk and getting a sense of where you come from and what you do, and hopefully other people have out there. I know I can say on your behalf, you're very happy for people to contact you directly via LinkedIn is the easy way of doing it. So I would encourage anybody watching this either now or watching the video later on to follow up with you directly and ask any more questions. From my point of view, if you're wondering what I'm doing, MedComsNetworking.com, or specifically, if you're interested in new jobs and coming into a business like this, FirstMedCommsJob.com has a load of information, resources, services, and so on that you're welcome to access. And I'm personally very happy to hear from you if I can help you. So just for the moment, I'm going to ask you all to give us a wave goodbye and stop the recording. Those of you watching us today, don't rush away. We've still got a few minutes and we will carry on to the top of the hour. But huge thank you to you guys for joining us today. It was really interesting. Hopefully the audience has got a lot out of it. I would encourage you all to talk to each other and follow up as necessary. So on that note, stay well in these rather uncertain times, and thank you very much. So quick wave and bye-bye. Bye.
Bye.